Hi, and welcome to Quilt Street. I'm Mary Kate Karr-Petras.
And I'm Rhonda Lother.
And today we are here to talk about
Fabric.
which is why most of us get into it in the first place. Wouldn't you agree?
I do. I totally agree.
Yeah, it's what draws us in is those beautiful prints, the beautiful colors. The variety is amazing these days.
There's so many options.
Yeah. And there are a variety of fabrics that you could use in a quilt. Aside from cotton, there are linen quilts, polyester, if you can believe it. Sometimes people use like a fleece polyester for a backing, like on a baby quilt or even a man cave quilt.
Yeah, stadium quilt even, and keep warm watching a game.
Yeah, absolutely. But today we're talking about cotton, quilting cotton, especially as a beginner. You just want to stick with 100% quilting cotton. And there are a couple of reasons for that. For one, it is, again, 100% cotton. It just behaves nicely, it lays nicely. It's a medium weight fabric and it's woven. And that's also very important when you're looking for fabric to buy for a quilt. You want to stick with woven fabrics. Knit fabrics are, well, knit, like a t-shirt, right?
Yes, and although a knit is great for a t-shirt, it stretches to accommodate your body and movement. You don't want stretch in your quilts because you're cutting and sewing for accuracy. You don't want anything stretching and pulling,
right,
so that you lose those accurate measurements you've worked so hard to get.
Yeah. So you're just going to go to your local quilt shop, perhaps a big box store or online, and you're going to buy 100% cotton. How do you buy fabric, though? As we said, you can buy it online. A lot of people do buy it online these days. You like to buy online?
I do.
Right?
I buy a lot online. I kind of live out in the country, and so that's really about the only option for me unless I'm visiting a large town. And I have found that most quilt shops online want you to make at least a half-yard minimum cut, which is fine with me because I like to add to my fabric stash.
Right. If you do have the opportunity, though, we do recommend that when you're starting out, you try to go and look at the fabric and not just look at it.
Touch it.
Feel it. You pet it. People talk about petting the fabric in a very safe way.
It's a thing.
It is a thing. And so, but the advantage of going to the shop is you can actually feel the fabric. You can get a better sense of the color of the fabric too, because online monitor changes can affect, your perception of the colors.
Right.
So how do you buy fabric in a shop? If you've never done it, it can feel maybe a little intimidating or unfamiliar at first. So fabric comes rolled onto bolts, which are these cardboard inserts. Let's see if we can get that shot on camera. And it comes rolled on this bolt. When you go into the shop, you're going to pick out the bolts of fabric that you want, and you're going to carry them around with you or in your cart, and take them up to the front counter, and you're going to tell the shop employee exactly how much you want of each fabric. And then they're going to unroll it as such, and
see the selvage.
so you can see the selvage. It is wound onto the bolts lengthwise, and it's cut crosswise. We'll get to that in a second. But just so you know, so they're going to make this cut in this direction and then hand you this piece, and that's what you're going to pay for. The nice thing also about a bolt is usually there's some printing on the end that talks about the fabric content, probably going to be 100% cotton.
Or check to make sure that it is 100% cotton.
True. Okay, so you've got your fabric, whether it came in the mail or you took it home from the store. And now the question is, do you pre-wash it? Pre-washing can be a very divisive issue in the quilting community. And it means simply running your fabric through the washer generally, or some people hand wash it. Washing it before you start cutting it, before you start using it in a quilt. Where do you stand on this really divisive issue?
I went through a brief period of pre-washing. A lot of instructions in the 90s especially would recommend pre-washing.
Right.
But I think fabric has come a long way since then, and it tends to be more color fast. So you're not worried about fading or that sort of thing, or the colors bleeding, the colors running. I've really not had that issue in many, many years. And one thing I noticed in a home I lived in previously was my sewing room was exposed to the sun. And when I would get home and fold my fabric up and store it on the shelves, over a long period of time, the fabrics I had pre-washed got faded on those edges that were exposed.
That's interesting.
Because I didn't have whatever kind of protective coating was on the fabric to begin with. And so I decided from that moment on I was not going to pre-wash.
Interesting. Yeah, they do treat the fabric in the manufacturing process with something called sizing. I'm not exactly sure what it does, but it does give it a nice finish, and it makes it lie nice and flat, and it's just part of the manufacturing process. One thing to keep in mind is if you are sensitive to chemicals, you might want to pre-wash your fabric. Just as a matter of course. I've had experiences where I've been dealing with a lot of fabric over the course of a few hours, touching it, folding it, and I have felt it on my hands. I could just sort of feel like a little...
Sometimes I feel that when I've used a lesser quality cotton as well.
That's true.
Maybe not a quilt shop cotton.
So it's the point being, you're entering into a fraught discussion sometimes, and it's really up to you to decide whether you want to wash it or not. The advantage of not washing it is it does maintain a little bit more of a, I don't know, not a stiff hand, but a flatter, more manageable.
Right, it tends to lie flat on the cutting mat, on the ironing board. It just really tends to stay flat and do what I want it to do without a lot of coaxing from me.
Yeah, it's easier to press nice and keep it nice and flat and square, so that it handles better. It goes through the machine a little bit better. This is a piece that you pre-washed in your machine at home,
yes.
Right?
This came from the same cut of fabric. I just simply cut it further in half and washed this piece and not that one.
So you can kind of see it's just a little more wrinkled. So when you go to press this, you might want to use some sort of starch or pressing spray to make it lie flatter so that it's easier to cut. You're going to get some little, I don't know, little thread bobbles or whatever here at the ends, and the fraying of the edge. That's another way you can tell if it's been pre-washed or not. So that's pre-washing.
It's completely a personal decision. Whichever way you want to do it, there's no right or wrong. It's whatever your personal preference is.
Right. So let's talk about direction in fabric, because this really matters. This is kind of not up for debate. So as we were saying before, I believe, I'm going to turn it like this. There we go. This is the length of the fabric, and you can tell because this is the selvage edge. And this is the edge, or these are the edges that go onto the loom that hold it lengthwise, and then this is the width of fabric. If we stretch this out, and you can see, this is probably about, what, 45 inches is the standard width for quilting cotton. So again, when we talk about
width of fabric, from selvage to selvage is width of fabric, or we abbreviate that as WOF often.
And then length of fabric, you're going to come across that a little less often, but that is abbreviated LOF. LOF, length of fabric, is your most stable stretch. You're not going to get much stretch at all along the length of the fabric. You can see here, it's pretty sturdy.
Pretty taut.
With the fabric, here, why don't you?
Sure.
With the fabric is, you get, even though it's on grain, it still stretches a little bit more. Where you get the most stretch is on the bias, which is the 45-degree angle. And there are times that you want to work with that bias stretch. Most of the time in piecing, you don't. You want to avoid it as much as possible. And when we're writing patterns, we're trying to find ways to avoid that for you as much as possible.
Exactly.
As well.
You want to minimize any bias edges that can get distorted the more you handle them.
Yeah, yeah. So I just want to show you really quickly why finding that grain line matters. The grain line being either the vertical or the horizontal. As long as you're on grain, vertically or horizontally, you're pretty much good to go. And if pattern needs to be specific, it will be specific about how to cut the fabric. But most of the time, that differentiation is not going to make much of a difference. These are two patches I cut, and one of them is just slightly off. and it's this one, right? This one is more on grain. And you can see also that the threads are coming loose a little bit here along the edge, but not too bad. Whereas this patch that is a little off grain, look at how much that stretches.
It does stretch, and you have some more threads on the edge as well.
Yeah, and it frays a lot more. And when I go to piece that to its neighbor, I'm going to be in for a world of hurt if I keep cutting my fabric like that.
Even just looking at this on the table, it may not register as well above, but even just the little bit she's handled this fabric, this is still lying very flat, whereas this one already has some little ups and downs on the edge where it's been handled and it's got some little waves in it.
Right. Sometimes fabric is wound onto the bolt, kind of wonky, and it can be kind of distorted. And even though you may line up your edges, and we will talk about this a little bit more when we talk about cutting best practices, but it may look like your fabric is lined up properly, but through no fault of your own, just how the fabric was manufactured, it may be kind of distorted. So if it's really important to you to find that true grain line, you want to tear your fabric. This is your favorite part, isn't it? Scissors, please. Some shops will tear fabric for you when they're cutting it or when you're buying it. You don't see that a lot these days. Let's do a bigger strip. And what's going to happen is I just made that little snip, and it's going to tear. Oh, it's so cathartic. Right along that grain line. Ta-da! Did that set your teeth on edge?
Just a little.
Yeah, just a little. So what it does result in a wavy edge, as you can see. And you can trim that up, but there that is your straight of grain right there. And it gives you a really nice, even place to start from, and you can get perfectly cut on grain fabrics at that point.
And you can press this back down so it's not wavy.
True. You can press it down, or you can just give it a real
little pat.
Yeah. Just keep petting the fabric, makes it happy. So that's yardage. But we also live in an age where fabric companies do a lot of pre-packaging for us, and we call them precuts. And we have a lovely selection of precuts here. And this is really, I think, also kind of the eye candy that draws in a lot of new quilters.
It really
is. Gorgeous packages.
I remember when I first started quilting, I was just enamored with fabric bundles. I remember buying my very first bundle, and I was in the car as a passenger going home, and my mom was teasing me because I just kept petting the fabric. I just liked the tactile experience of the fabric. I loved how they coordinated. And I love these bundles because they're going to go together.
They really are. I mean, the companies do a great job in terms of balancing the colors and the values and the light versus dark. So let's talk really quickly about the types of precuts that you will encounter. First and foremost, we have our fat quarter bundles.
And here are some that are loose. And a fat quarter simply means it's a half yard cut in half. And a lot of times in quilting, it's a more useful piece. For example, if I bought a quarter yard of fabric, it would be this wide.
9 inches.
9 inches plus the width of fabric. So it'd be 9 inches by 42 to 44, depending. Whereas a fat quarter, you have the length of a half yard, but it's cut in half. So it's a much more usable piece. It works really well for a lot of quilts.
And there are patterns that are written for fat quarter quilts, for instance, but they come in these beautiful bundles. And then in the past, 10 to 15 years, other precuts have become very, very popular as well. Now, this is a 2.5 inch strip bundle, and these are commonly referred to as jelly rolls because that was the term that Moda Fabrics used for their precuts, jelly roll quilts. But a lot of manufacturers now have 2.5 inch strips. So they use their own branding for it. So
you'll find different names, but they're 2.5 inch wide precut strips because
by width of fabric.
Yes, and you'll find a lot of times that instructions call for 2.5 inch wide strips. Very common. So, even if cutting's not your thing exactly, this is a great option.
Yeah. And they have these pinked edges. I would just say one thing is just bear in mind that I think the measurement usually goes from the outside of the pinked edge to the other outside of the pinked edge. So
not from the V and the short part.
Exactly. So just keep that in mind when you're sewing with them. And then there are other pre-cuts. This is a 5-inch charm pack. Different manufacturers have their own branding, but charm pack is pretty common, standard.
Yeah, 5-inch squares that again can be cut down or used as is. And the largest pre-cut fabrics are often called layer cakes, and these are simply 10-inch squares, which you can use as they are for larger quilt blocks or setting squares, or you can cut them down into smaller pieces. And on the back here, it'll often show the different prints that are available inside this pack to give you an idea of what you're buying. And again, this will often be an example of each fabric that's available in that line.
Yeah.
So it's if you're a big fabric collector, it's a good way to have a little piece of all of it.
Layer cakes are fun too because they open up. You can subcut them.
Yes.
You've got 4 of these in each one of these. So there's a lot of subcutting flexibility that you get with a 10-inch square pack.
Sometimes when I've opened up the package, there's a little cheat sheet inside of different ways you can cut it to get 2.5 inch. It'll show you how to get the most bang for your buck, as it were, but of how to cut these down to smaller pieces if you want to do that.
All right. So I think that's it. That's what we have today for fabric and the types of fabrics that you as a beginner will most likely be working with. And next time we're going to be talking about batting and thread.